Welcome to my channel again. Today I'll be going over different types of configuration available in Traefik reverse proxy and what's the difference between dynamic and static configuration and how we can configure routers, services, and middlewares using these configurations. Let's get started. Traefik gets all this configuration using providers and referencing a Traefik dynamic configuration object from other providers. Here is an example they gave on how we can use the file provider or the Docker provider or the Kubernetes provider. Once you've set up the provider, you can just add everything to the Docker labels if you're using Docker provider. So here, for example, they have added Traefik.http routers, mycontainer.middlewares, and this is how they added the middleware. They have specified here that the middleware is actually present in a file. Here you can see that middleware, which is in a file, right? Using the add file notation. Similarly, in Kubernetes, they have added an ingress route, and the spec has the entry points, the routes, the middleware, and all of that. More info later on, but there are all the supported providers they have for configurations. Docker, as we looked at, Kubernetes, we have console, we have Nomad, ECS, Marathon, Rancher, File, Redis, which is also a very popular one. It has some problems with some default configurations, but we're working to fix those. HTTP, manual, JSON format, I don't know if it's popular. Now Traefik v1.7 had is totally different as compared to Traefik v2 because the syntax of the configuration is totally changed. The syntax and how they also have a migration guide on how we can move to v2, but that's for later on. That we discussed, we have all these different options to configure Traefik, right? But there are like two kinds of configurations as well. One is the dynamic, one is the static. So if we look at the static configuration in the static configuration reference, let's look at the file configuration. In YAML, file provider has a static configuration like this. I see static configuration to be something which is for the Traefik binary itself, right? So here we are setting the server's transport, insecure, skip, verify, the root CAs for all the hosts or routes, entry points like the port 80 and 443 we saw, the redirections for HTTP to HTTPS. Again, this here we end the entry points, and then we have the providers, the Docker provider, file provider, which directory to look into it. Should we watch the directory using fsnotify, setting up the providers, and then access logs, tracing, observability, how the logs gonna look like, what's the level by the file path of the logs, what's the format, is it JSON, is it something else. Access logs is logging every detail when Traefik has any requests, and we can add filters on the logs itself. So this is how we configure Traefik. Now the way we can configure the static configuration is using either file, which is this, using CLI, which is passing CLI options to the Traefik binary, and we have a long list of CLI options. And Traefik environment variables. So you can pretty much set up Traefik static configuration using environment variables. Let's take a random example. So here, for example, they have Traefik providers Nomad endpoint TLS key. So when we are configuring the provider Nomad, it needs a TLS key. This is how you pass into the Traefik Docker image or the machine is running on. So this is Traefik static configuration. Now let's talk about dynamic. So dynamic configuration has many more options to configure. We have file, we have Docker, we have Kubernetes, we have Kubernetes gateway, console, Nomad. We went over some of them. So KV is key value, and key value applies to all the providers which support key value pairs like Redis. Let's take an example of that. So here you can find all the references to every possible way you can configure Traefik, and I think it's a best effort basis where they have given every other example, they might be missing some, but let's do a random example here. So in order to configure dynamic configuration, you can do like Traefik /http /services o2 mirroring and health check. So here they have listed a service called service 02, and they have added an health check service. What's going on here is we can take an example of this service. So in the file provider, we created a service using such as syntax like http services service foo load balancer and then the two servers. In the key value pair notification notation, it could be something like Traefik / I'm just looking over here how this looks like. So Traefik has to be there since it's the default key value pairs starting key. http / services and then the service name. For example, here in this case, it is service 01, your service foo1 load balancer. You can use either the file provider for dynamic config, or you can use the key value provider or any other provider if that's what you want. But what's the advantage of the dynamic configuration? It's called dynamic, right? It has to have some advantages. The dynamic configuration advantages, if you have, for example, graphic server on your host somewhere, right? Now you add a new service, for example, right? You just call service foo3 and you want to load balance it as well. So any request that comes has to be load balanced between service 1, 2, and now there is another service. So this local laptop can access this Traefik server using this domain, and it can either go to service 1, 2, or 3. And we add that service in our configuration. But the problem with the static config is if I were to put this in the static configuration and update it, Traefik wouldn't really know the existence of service 3. So dynamic configuration helps on the fly updates to the configuration. So if you make a change to the configuration, add service, add middlewares, change something, change routes, Traefik would know and it'll act upon it as soon as possible. So this is where dynamic configuration shines. Whereas static configuration, it's static. Traefik has to be restarted after changing this config, changing providers, adding entry points, making changes to the access logs, APIs, dashboards, all of that. You have to restart Traefik. And it's like mutually exclusive. Either you can use file, either you can use CLI, either you can use environment variables to configure static configuration. On the other hand, dynamic configuration, you can use a mix of everything using the @ symbol. That basically rounds it up. It was a brief introduction on how the whole Traefik proxies ecosystem works. Here we covered what routers were, what different types of configuration we have, static and dynamic. We also went through this example of how we can configure our Traefik reverse proxy to achieve what we want to achieve here. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed or liked this video and gained some knowledge from it, please share, since Traefik reverse proxy is one of the most widely used and supported proxies with like 40,000 stars on GitHub. I hope this was helpful.